They say that this could be a long war measured in years. And I think everybody understands why this is happening. But is it sustainable? What do you say to those families who say, listen, we can't afford to pay $4.85 a gallon for months, if not years. This is just not sustainable.
Well, what you heard from the president today was a clear articulation of the stakes. This is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm.
But why? Why would they be so hell-bent on destroying the fossil fuel industry? So hell-bent that they would be willing to commit political suicide to do it. 2 words: Black Rock. Biden's skyrocketing gas prices are intentional.
Mr. Reagan.
The Biden administration has been telling you for months now that the skyrocketing gas prices are due to the post-COVID increase in demand. They blamed greedy oil companies.
We begin with President Biden calling on U.S. oil companies to produce more gas and reduce prices.
Then they blamed Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine.
And the White House is placing the blame for the pain at the pump squarely on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin, calling it the Putin price hike.
And then they blamed gas stations.
We know gas station owners aren't really the ones running away to the bank when gas prices go up. News organizations need to be a lot more forceful here, Brian, in calling out the president when he misleads the public like this.
But the truth is that Biden himself has indicated that his administration will invest more American tax dollars in so-called green energy and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, reduce carbon emissions. He's been saying this since his days on the campaign trail.
Aiming to remove greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector by 2035 and the entire economy by 2050.
And a lot of people like that. Green energy. It sounds good. It sounds clean. It sounds environmentally friendly. The problem with that, of course, is that in order to artificially switch Americans to so-called green energy, there will inevitably be a great cost. And regular Americans will bear the burden of that great cost, either in taxes or higher fuel prices, or in this case, both. So you see, high fuel prices are not a surprising side effect of the transition to so-called green energy. It's part of the plan. You see, the Biden administration wants gas prices to be high. Why? Well, in part, in order to pressure Americans into buying electric cars.
We're going to make sure that we are able to take the federal fleet and turn it into a fleet that's run on their electric vehicles.
We're for cutting the cost of electric vehicles, because when you have an electric vehicle, then you're also going to be able to save on gas, but you got to be able to afford it in the first place. Right. Now, we're actually starting to see on some models, the costs come to where even if your car payment's a little higher, your gas payment will be a little lower and you come out ahead.
We're going to invest in, for example, 50,000 charging stations on our highways so that we can own the electric car market of the future.
But it is far worse than just pressuring Americans to buy electric cars. The Biden administration is actively trying to destroy the fossil fuel industry entirely. And they say this openly.
Nobody's going to build another coal-fired plant in America. No one's going to build another oil-fired plant in America. They're going to move to renewable energy. No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated and no more subsidies for either one of those.
As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes.
Now, very few people took Joe Biden seriously when he said these things. Most people dismiss this as campaign rhetoric, a way to placate the radical left without actually scaring moderates, because, I mean, eliminating fossil fuel consumption is ridiculous. We have no practical way of doing this, and even trying to do this would be economically devastating. So no one took this rhetoric seriously. But now it looks like he's actually making good on these promises. As soon as Biden was in office, he took steps to regulate the fossil fuel industry, and it looks like these regulations are only going to get worse.
One of his first executive orders was rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Another one was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. One of the most controversial ones, which is that pause in the new oil and gas leases on federal land and federal waters.
He cancels the Keystone Pipeline. He halts new oil and gas leases on federal land. He rejoins the Paris Climate Agreement. He takes 30% of land off limits for oil and gas. Halts drilling in Anwar, the incredibly oil-rich small region of Alaska. Congress reverses Trump's natural gas regulations. Biden reverses Trump NEPA regulations, which made it easier to drill. Interior begins imposing the, quote, social cost of carbon. The moratorium on oil drilling in Chaco Canyon. Biden cancels remaining lease sales, and the SEC proposes the anti-oil rule.
Biden, in May of this year, canceled one of the largest refinery expansions in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Shut down Alaska, shut down offshore, shut down the XL pipeline, make the leases next to impossible to get, have uncertain carbon taxes. The whole global infrastructure of energy is based on future forecasts of pricing. It's a global commodity. What the president says really matters.
So the president said that he would decide very soon when it comes to declaring a possible national emergency. But remember, a declaration of national emergency could unleash sweeping powers for a president.
New EPA regulations on our utilities, taking more prime oil and gas lands on federal lands off of limits, and export controls so that we can't export our oil and gas. That would destroy our American oil and gas industry.
These regulations have helped cause an international reduction in the total fossil fuel supply, and it's prevented domestic American fuel from buoying that supply quickly. And as we all know, this has resulted in skyrocketing fuel prices and in turn increased prices on just about everything. And the Biden administration staunchly refuses to change course. Countless economists and energy experts have explained that gas prices can be reduced by easing regulation.
What can the government do to help expanding the capacity at refineries?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of it would be regulations. A lot of refineries have shut down because the regulatory costs have gone up.
So what the administration needs to do is really, in a lot of ways, just get out of the way.
Get the hell out of the way.
If tomorrow morning he woke up and said, look, just kidding on the shutdown. We need energy security, and starts talking about we're going to open up that XM pipeline again. We're going to at least license 3 more refineries. And you start by jawboning. That's what moves the futures market. That's the solution. It's at his fingertips.
It's simple, it's quick, it's easy, and yet the Biden administration insists that we must transition to green energy.
And when it comes to the gas prices, we're going through an incredible transition that is taking place, that God willing, when it's over, will be stronger and the world will be stronger and less reliant on fossil fuels.
One Biden official actually let slip that high gas prices are a necessary part of our transition to the liberal world order.
This is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm.
After that interview was broadcast, everybody basically did a double take. The what? World order? I don't think so. Using terms that sound like they come from a supervillain in a James Bond film probably isn't the best way to comfort Americans about their suffering. It's okay that you can't pay rent this month. You're contributing to the liberal world order. You know, I felt bad that I couldn't feed my children this month, but now that I know that I'm contributing to the liberal world order, I feel so much better about it. What I'm going to explain in this video is why the administration is doing this. Most people think it's ideological. They think that everybody in the Biden administration is a true believer, that these people genuinely think that climate change is an existential threat and that the world is going to end in 12 years.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
No, they do not believe that. This administration knows full well that all that stuff is nonsense. And what's crazier is that these radical left climate hysteria policies are killing them in the polls.
America is rejecting his whole radical green climate agenda and his big government socialism. This is a TIPS poll. 32% support the climate agenda, 57% don't. And then there's another one, the Monmouth poll. This is what top concern for Americans. I love this. 33 inflation, 15 gas prices, 9 the economy, 6 everyday bills. Oops, 1% climate change. But politically, people are not stupid. American voters are not as stupid as the Bidens think.
This $5 a price is going to affect him in a brutal way in the midterm.
Democrats are destroying their chances of maintaining control of the House and the Senate in November. And after that, they're going to lose the presidency in 2024. And this is all because they refuse to take action to lower gas prices. But why? Why would they be so hell-bent on destroying the fossil fuel industry? So hell-bent that they would be willing to commit political suicide to do it. 2 words: Black Rock. I'll explain in one moment. First, I have to sell you something. over the years, you've probably tried different investments in stocks and mutual funds. You know they can be up and down all over the place. But with inflation running at 8.5%, its highest rate in 40 years, do you really need that kind of uncertainty? Being able to sleep at night knowing your investments aren't about to crash, well, that is worth its weight in gold. And speaking of gold, if you've been jumping from one investment to the next, the gold IRA with Noble Gold is perfect. With gold, you shield your gains from taxes. You keep the real value of your wealth. You own a global asset, something tangible, and you protect your wealth against economic crashes. What is not to like? And this month, for every cash deal above $20K, you'll get an incredible 3-ounce silver American Virtue coin completely free as a thank you. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold. Call 877-646-5347 right now to find out more, or visit noblegoldinvestments.com. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. So what is BlackRock?
This is BlackRock, what some call the most influential financial institution in the world, the world's largest shadow bank, and perhaps the company that owns the world.
BlackRock is a financial giant. It's the largest investor on planet Earth with over $9 trillion in assets. That's a pile of cash equal to about 1/10 of a year's global economic activity.
BlackRock is the largest asset management firm on the planet. BlackRock owns $9 trillion worth of assets. To illustrate this point a little bit more, $9 trillion is more than the GDP of every single country on the planet except for 2, United States and China. And they own a part of almost everything. And when I say everything, I really mean everything.
BlackRock is indeed influential. In the US, it owns at least 5% of most major companies. That gives the firm lots of voting power to determine how public businesses operate.
They're one of the top shareholders of many of the biggest publicly traded companies like Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and even other major banks like Wells Fargo and Chase.
The names on the screen are the 7 biggest banks in America. BlackRock is either the largest or one of the largest shareholders in all of these 7 banks. In some way, shape, or form, your money is finding its way to BlackRock.
They also have shares in companies all over Europe, including industries like energy, oil and gas, transportation, food, and of course, finance.
It's estimated that in one way or another, BlackRock and Vanguard, which is the second largest asset management in the world, owns part of more than 90% of the media that we consume on a daily basis.
Led by a very well-connected billionaire by the name of Larry Fink. Larry Fink is known as the guy who always wanted more than he had.
Larry had just one ambition: to build a super smart robot that could pick out risk and opportunity in the market and do it better than any computer or human could do.
BlackRock spent years developing a risk management software that they call Aladdin.
Asset, liability, and debt derivative investment network. Aladdin now controls $21 trillion of our global economy. This one robot directs the actions of the US Federal Reserve, almost every major bank and investment fund on Wall Street, and over 17,000 traders. It controls half of all ETFs, 17% of the bond market, 10% of the global stock market, and carries out 250,000 trades every day and billions of forecasts every week. Every major bank, company, and investment fund has come to rely on Aladdin and its all-powerful AI and algorithms to beat the market.
In past times of crisis, the Federal Reserve System has asked BlackRock for help managing funds. In 2008, New York Federal Reserve leader Timothy Geithner tapped BlackRock to manage the distressed assets of Bear Stearns and AIG. Geithner and Fink share a close personal relationship. The two sit on the board of the Council of Foreign Relations and were communicating frequently in the Great Recession. And in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, the Fed system called on BlackRock again. In the following months, the central bank purchased trillions of dollars in various assets and debts, including corporate bonds. BlackRock was tapped to manage this portion of the purchases. Experts warn that BlackRock's work with the Fed could raise conflicts of interest. BlackRock today is positioning itself as a socially conscious voice of the financial industry. According to BlackRock, risk management today means adapting to the changing climate.
The largest oil and gas producers and the largest carbon emitters are state-controlled enterprises.
Their leadership has the sway to push global institutions into action.
And look, BlackRock doesn't actually own these assets themselves. They're just managing other people's wealth. They're asset managers. So the individual employees over at BlackRock, they're not quite as rich as they seem. And some of BlackRock's defenders on YouTube have made the point that because they don't actually own the money that they're investing, they don't control any of the companies that they've invested in. But this is totally incorrect. When you manage that much money, whether it's your money or not, you still have all the influence that that money can buy. And $10 trillion buys a lot of influence. You will remember that in 2021, the Democrats passed an obscenely expensive $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. This was, of course, just an excuse to funnel money into radical left businesses and organizations, but why infrastructure? Here's Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, discussing infrastructure way back in 2017.
Across the country, we have underinvested in our infrastructure. We're going to have to invest heavily in the electrification of our roads. We're going to have to be investing in broadband and all the other things that we're going to need to do to build the cities of the future. And so some of this is why we need more than ever, I'm making this your question on infrastructure, why we need more than ever public-private partnership, because we're not going to have cities capable of financing or states financing their infrastructure needs.
So, did the Democrat politicians' focus on infrastructure originate with Larry Fink? Was this so-called infrastructure bill a way to placate Larry Fink? I think it most certainly was. Remember, Democrats had already funded all of the radical left crap with the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. And it is amazing how well those bills worked out, isn't it? America is doing so well.
Kamala Harris was standing under an American Rescue Plan backdrop in that clip. That's one of the reasons that we have this inflation is because of that $2 trillion plan early last year.
Democrats rescued America right into a recession. And incidentally, both the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill both heavily subsidized the so-called green economy, the same so-called green economy that BlackRock happens to be heavily invested in.
There is an argument to be made that there is money to be made by investing in clean technologies and the like. If BlackRock were sitting here right now, they would make that argument because that's where the money is.
Well, it's where the government money is, Andrew. Sure, there may be money to make in these industries because their Democratic pals in Congress are rewarding them with all kinds of tax breaks and government subsidies.
And if you still don't think BlackRock has the influence over the Biden administration that I'm suggesting that they do, consider that 2 of their employees hold critical positions within the Biden administration.
Right now, BlackRock CEO's former chief of staff, Wally Adamio, is literally Joe Biden's deputy secretary of the Treasury, the person who runs all day-to-day operations of our Treasury Department. His other former employee is Brian Deese, the current head of the National Economic Council, who before his White House job was, quote, head of sustainable investing for BlackRock.
People often wonder who the most powerful, darkest, most sinister puppet masters in the deep state are. Well, BlackRock is certainly one of the darkest puppet masters of all. You see, the deep state is not some kooky idea only whispered about on 8chan by followers of Q. The deep state is very real. The deep state is merely the undue influence that Wall Street, major corporations, industries, unions, billionaires, and other interested parties have on the federal government. It's what we used to call crony capitalism. But now it's on steroids, and we call it the deep state. That's why Trump was so hated by the establishment. He stood in the way of the deep state. So why does BlackRock want to destroy the fossil fuel industry? Well, I don't think they actually want to destroy the fossil fuel industry. Not exactly. I think that was all just hyperbolic rhetoric coming from a barely functional Joe Biden in order to gain the support of the radical left. What BlackRock wants to do is to artificially shift America to so-called green energy, and making fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel more expensive. Well, that helps hasten the transition. And why does BlackRock want to hasten the transition to so-called green energy? Greed. Simple, old-fashioned greed. You see, BlackRock is heavily invested in so-called green energy. Now, they're also heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, and you might not think that they'd sacrifice their fossil fuel investments for their so-called green energy investments. But they definitely would. And this is because the fossil fuel industry supplies developed nations at maximum capacity. There's not a lot of room for growth. They've hit the ceiling. Think of fossil fuels like Coca-Cola. And think of so-called green energy as a tiny little alternative cola company. You invest $1 million in both companies. Coca-Cola isn't going to grow all that much, right? Sure, the company makes a healthy profit. Maybe you grow a couple of percentage points over the year. But what if your tiny little alternative cola company becomes super popular? Maybe they take over like 50% of the cola market. Well, then your $1 million investment in this tiny alternative cola company suddenly grows 40 times. Suddenly your $1 million turns into $40 million. Not only do you not mind losing some of your Coca-Cola investment, heck, you could have lost the entire Coca-Cola investment. Coke could go bankrupt and it wouldn't matter. You've made $39 million. But BlackRock doesn't just have $1 million invested in so-called green energy. They've got billions. And so you see, all this comes down to greed. The high gas prices, inflation, transitioning to so-called green energy, it's all about money. BlackRock does not care about people. They do not care about the environment. They don't care about woke politics or even America versus China. BlackRock cares about just one thing: profit. And that also goes for Democrats. You know, it's ironic that Democrat politicians have insisted for years that it's the Republicans that are the party of the fat cat industrialists, greedy tycoons that would sell out ordinary Americans just to get even richer, when all along it was the Democrats themselves that were the crooked profiteers willing to sell out the American people. Now, you might be questioning some of my assumptions here. You might say, well, maybe it's not BlackRock's influence. Maybe BlackRock just predicted that the Biden administration would subsidize so-called green energy, and they invested accordingly. And that's a good point. Maybe that's true. And so the question is, do the policies of the Biden administration dictate the direction of BlackRock, or does BlackRock dictate the policies of the Biden administration? Well, this is a clip from an interview with Larry Fink in which he discusses his influence on the government of Germany.
The German car companies are at the precipice of transforming their entire fleet of cars to electric. They talk about it 2021, 2022, they're going to have a fleet of electric cars. If I was sitting in Germany today, I would be focusing on things like making sure our cities, our autobahns are prepared for the electrification of cars. That could be a great fiscal spending. They could be really transforming their cities right now. They certainly have.
Have you talked to the German leadership about this?
I have spoken to many people in Germany about it. I'm not going to respond to who I spoke to, but a lot. And this is the conversation we're having.
So what it sounds like is that Larry Fink, the chairman and CEO of BlackRock, is in Germany instructing their government to invest in electric car infrastructure. And in that same interview, which took place in 2019, Fink seemed to insist that a moderate Democrat would be the best option to run against Trump in 2020.
Right now, the Democratic Party is seeing, every day a new candidate. We'll see in the next 6 to 8 months who are going to be the leading candidates. I would just remind everybody, and I know you know this, Eric, the Democratic Party won control of the House by having more moderates, or more centrists. It was not the left part of the Democratic Party that won the incremental houses. Where most of the new names that we're reading about, who are talking about these new policies, they come from very solid blue districts already, and they may be moving the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party won control of the House by having more centrist Democrats.
Now, I don't think anybody really believes that Biden was organically chosen by Democrat voters. I think that we're all well aware of how the Democrat Party chooses their candidates. And so how much influence did Larry Fink have on that decision? I'll let you guys guess about that one. But I think what's most concerning is the BlackRock employees who have been directly placed inside the Biden administration.
BlackRock CEO's former chief of staff, Wally Adamio, is literally Joe Biden's deputy secretary of the Treasury. His other former employee is Brian Deese, the current head of the National Economic Council.
So again, I ask, do the policies of the Biden administration dictate the direction of BlackRock, or does BlackRock dictate the policies of the Biden administration? Either way, whenever Biden or Pelosi or Karine Jean-Pierre says that we need to invest in green energy for our future, the word "our" isn't indicating the American people. It indicates investors in BlackRock. But the "we" in "we need to invest" does mean the American people. In other words, the Biden administration is investing the tax dollars of hardworking Americans so that rich BlackRock investors can get even richer. And let me just say to anybody who wants to maybe argue that Joe Biden and the administration is making real efforts to lower gas prices, everything they've done, everything that they've said that they've done for that purpose, to lower fuel prices, it has all been political theater. It is a lie. It is a show. They are pretending to try to lower fuel prices. It's all fake. Tucker Carlson pointed out the other day that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been siphoned in order to create the appearance that Joe Biden is tackling the problem.
As a political matter, since this is still sort of a democracy, it scared the hell out of people, and polls showed that. Democrats and Republicans, no matter who they voted for, were worried above all about rising energy prices because it hurt them directly every single day. So Joe Biden started yelling, "It's Putin's price hike. Putin did it." But it's so dumb. It's so provably untrue that no one believed it. So the administration had to do something. That's why, in late March, in an act of desperation, Biden did maybe the worst thing that he has done since becoming president, and that's saying a lot. He started to sell off one of this country's most important natural resources, one of our most valuable assets. It's called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. It's controlled by the Department of Energy. So what Biden could have done is produce more oil domestically, but that would have been too easy and too good for the United States and its long-term interests. Instead, he decided to do something so crazy and so dangerous that only someone who was intentionally trying to harm the United States would even consider it.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
So we're releasing 1 million barrels per day for a total of more than 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is held in caverns in a couple of states. How much is that? It's a staggering figure. Now, no president in American history has ordered a drawdown this large. In 1991, at the beginning of Operation Desert Storm, which was an actual war with real American soldiers involved, the U.S. government released 17 million barrels of oil. The U.S. released just 20 million barrels after Hurricane Katrina destroyed parts of the Gulf Coast where so many refineries are. But now we're releasing many times that figure from the reserve, all to protect the Democratic Party from getting what it deserves in the midterm elections in November. And as a result of that unbelievably reckless, in fact, criminal decision, our strategic oil reserves are now at their lowest level in nearly 40 years, and they are dropping fast.
And it kind of makes sense for Biden to release fuel from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve because it would only lower gas prices and ease American suffering very minimally and very temporarily. And in turn, it would help Democrats to win elections in the midterms. But that's not what's happened. Almost inexplicably, Biden has released the fuel from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and then sold it to foreign nations.
Principles of supply and demand would suggest that this would work in the short term. Releasing all this oil should have lowered gas prices until the reserve ran out, which it will. So you inject more petroleum into the market and prices for gas should drop. But here's the amazing thing. That's not happening. Since Joe Biden started releasing all this oil from our reserves, which he does not own, you do, we do. What has happened to gas prices? They haven't dropped. They've kept going up. It turns out the oil being released isn't for us. It's going to India and China. According to Reuters, and we're quoting, more than 5 million barrels of oil that were part of a historic U.S. emergency reserve release to lower domestic fuel prices were exported to Europe and Asia last month. The piece continues, quote, cargoes of SPR crude, oil from our reserves, were also headed to the Netherlands and to a Reliance refinery in India, an industry source said. A third cargo, buckle your seatbelt, headed to China. To China. So as gas prices set records in this country, as American citizens who are born here and vote and pay taxes cannot afford to fuel their own cars, the Biden administration is selling off our emergency oil reserves to China.
Why would he do this? Because again, he has no intention of reducing gas prices. Despite the damage that this is doing to Democrats politically, high gas prices is still the plan. And I know that the Biden administration has been touting the 50-cent drop in gas lately, but I suspect that this was a mistake. And I also suspect that fuel prices will continue to rise because to reduce gas prices would be counterproductive to their transition to so-called renewable energy. And this would in turn reduce the profit that BlackRock, Vanguard, and other investors expect to make from this transition.
We're going through an incredible transition.
But then why release the fuel from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at all? Well, it might help the Democrats a little politically. Biden needs to look like he's doing something. He needs to look like he's trying to help reduce gas prices. And so he pretends to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to supplement supply. As I said before, political theater. It's kind of like forcing people to wear cloth masks during COVID. Look, we're doing something. This will save you. You know, it actually took me a long time to research and write the script for this video, and in an earlier draft, I wrote the following. Bizarrely, while selling off our domestic energy fuel reserves to foreign nations, Biden is at the same time saying that he wants to import oil from foreign sources. He's talking to Saudi Arabia and Venezuela about exporting oil to the U.S. Why export our own American fuel reserves just to import fuel from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia? I've not heard this from any news source, but I suspect, and this is entirely my own speculation, but I suspect that this too is just political theater. I don't believe that Biden has any intention of importing oil, or if he does, he intends to import just a fraction of what's needed, so to increase fuel prices even more and put even more pressure on Americans to go buy electric cars and to transition to so-called green energy.
President Biden returning from his trip overseas empty-handed and in a world of trouble. He secured no major oil deal after fist-bumping with the Saudis.
This was not a good trip to Saudi Arabia. He didn't accomplish any of his goals. More Saudi oil production, no.
I mean, that was basically a perfect prediction of what happened with the Saudi Arabia oil deal. Biden went there, fist bumped the Saudi prince, and then came home with no oil deal at all. It's almost as if he had no intention of supplementing our oil supply or reducing fuel prices. The irony of all of this is the ridiculous joke that Democrats actually care about poor people, because increasing fuel prices does not hurt wealthy Americans. But for poor Americans, increased gas prices may be the difference between paying rent and getting evicted, because skyrocketing gas prices do not just make it more expensive to fill up the tank, it also increases the price of all the goods and services that we buy on a daily basis. Everything that travels to the store, gets delivered to your house, this all costs money to ship. And as we all know, grocery prices have also skyrocketed recently. And all those nickels and dimes, they add up. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, this cost of living increase has an absurdly negative effect on your quality of life. In short, the Biden administration is making your life worse.
Rising prices have forced Bridget and Johnny Lovell to drastically change their way of life.
The other day, my kids were talking about how they miss eating Pizza Hut because that was, for us, it's a luxury item.
I've had to cut costs just to put the necessities first. Between inflation and me, inflation's winning.
Inflation has upended her business. Have there been events where you've just lost money?
Oh, 100%.
How hard is it living on a fixed income?
It is hard. And I feel so sorry for my friends that just don't have this kind of money as much as I do, because they're much worse off than me.
The nights after work are filled with dread, searching for a new place to live.
I would consider living in my car, yes. It's really hard. It's really hard. It's... It makes me feel useless.
And some of you may be shouting at your screens, China. China is also benefiting from Americans' transition to so-called green energy. And yes, you are right. Here's the thing. BlackRock is, surprise, surprise, heavily invested in China.
Larry Fink has gone on record saying he thinks his clients should triple their investments in China specifically. So they are taking some of that money and putting it overseas, hundreds of billions of dollars invested in companies that some of which are owned or co-owned by the Chinese Communist Party. It's really the same game they're playing in both countries. It's to suck up to elites, to government power in return for special favors, increased contracts. In mainland China, they cater to the CCP in a completely different way, but the goal is the same. It's to get special favors, and it's worked. BlackRock has the right, I believe they're the only company that has the right to operate a foreign-owned mutual fund in mainland China. And more recently, they were given the right to start managing pension fund assets in China. And again, this is very uncommon for a foreign company. And so I think it shows the quid pro quo that Larry has worked by funneling so much investment dollars into China.
Now, I could make an entire video about the massive advantage it will be for China, not to mention the massive danger it is for America if America completely switches over to so-called green energy.
As the world starts to turn away from fossil fuels, China is positioning itself as the king of clean energy, not only transforming its own energy system, but also building a supply chain that could leave the world uncomfortably dependent on China for its energy needs.
China has really expanded its grip, so it's the processing, it's the manufacturing, it's all the way down to your EVs and your battery packs. How the West deals with that, they're going to have to be a bit creative, whether that's solar panels or turbines or the elements that you will need to process along the way.
Some in the West are also concerned about China's dominance over the materials needed to make lithium-ion batteries. Cobalt, for example, is a scarce mineral produced mainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where China has bought up most of the supply.
I think any kind of excessive dependency is problematic, and energy dependency is no different. Think about Europe's dependency on Russia for gas, how problematic that has been. So if we're going to have the West as dependent on China for renewable energy, for green economy ingredients, it is not going to be a healthy situation.
Now, before I end this video, I do want to present you guys with my most tinfoil hat out there concern: the Marxist incentive. It's one thing to become unfathomably wealthy and powerful. It's another to actually take over the United States of America. And although controlling the entirety of the energy sector might give somebody a lot of control over America, turning America into a socialist country would truly give someone total control over America. Now, we know this because of a little something called history. Every country that has ever adopted a socialist framework has, instead of becoming a more egalitarian nation, rather become entirely authoritarian. And here's the thing: many of these radical left billionaires, these would-be dictators, they know this. And so before I looked into the financial incentives of deep state players like BlackRock, I actually considered the primary incentive for the high gas prices and the eventual destruction of the fossil fuel industry in America to be one method by which sinister actors might be trying to destroy our current democratic system, our constitutional republic. You see, even from the beginning, the Marxist strategy has always been to destroy infrastructure, to create civil unrest, and to create suffering. The point is to create enough suffering in a given country that the people of that country rise up against their government, tear it down entirely, and then grow in those ashes a new socialist system. Overnight, new authoritarian laws could take hold, and those who have ushered in this new socialist utopia would take their place as the all-powerful oligarchs of this great new socialist empire. Currently, the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world are Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and the various Russian, Chinese, and North Korean oligarchs of those and other similar countries.
Being perceived as the richest person on earth.
Well, I think Putin is significantly richer than me.
You really do, yeah?
Yes.
And it may be that the Soroses and the Larry Finks and the Hans-Jörg Weisses and the Klaus Schwabs of the world, it may be that they envy these dictators. Because once you're a billionaire, then what do you shoot for next? These men clearly have an insatiable ambition to greater and greater power and wealth. And the only level more powerful than a billionaire? Total authoritarian dictator. To control the wealth of entire nations, to control the militaries of entire nations. And what country would make one wealthier and more powerful than any other country on earth? The United States of America. In the end, this may be an attempt to burn down our great capitalist constitutional republic and erect a new socialist utopia out of those ashes. That may be the goal. After all, creating hysteria in order to grab more power is something that the Democrats seem to have no problem doing. Well, that's it for me, and remember, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant, it's just that the deep state is very real. Good night.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening.